Hey guys, here we are again, another snow day. So we're going to try to make things easy for you guys today. Hopefully you've already watched the Ed puzzle about the urinary system. That does a great job introducing the topics. And hopefully you can breeze through these notes with me so we can get an introduction to the kidneys. So an overview of what you're supposed to do today is to watch that Ed puzzle and complete it. I did set it so you can do it an unlimited number of times. So if you're having trouble getting a 10 out of 10, feel free to just do it as many times as you would like until you get that score that you're looking for. After finishing this video and copying down your notes in your notes packet you received in class yesterday, you can just comment in the discussion board. 3 things you're thankful for today. We're trying to stay on the positive side of things. 2 things you learned from either my video or the crash course video. And then 1 question you still have specifically about the content that was presented. Please have these things complete by 3 p.m. That's when I'll take attendance, or reach out to me if you can't get it done before then. All right, so let's get it done. So the urinary system is not one that we spend a ton of time thinking about until you have to use it. So we're going to discuss the anatomy, histology, and physiology of the kidney. We're going to spend a lot of time on those 2 very important organs, but we can't neglect the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra as well. We're going to talk about how it accomplishes the task of producing urine, which has a lot of important homeostatic functions for the body, including regulating pH, water balance, and osmolarity of the blood. So the urinary system is our second to last system this year, and it doesn't have many organs. It's kind of like the respiratory system in that it's so specialized for absorption and secretion that it really doesn't need many parts. It's very, very efficient at moderating the composition of the fluid reservoirs of the body, and the most important one being the blood. The prefix that we'll see a lot throughout the urinary system is nephro, which refers to the nephron, which is the functional unit inside the kidney. Just like our lungs have alveoli, each kidney has millions and millions of microscopic nephrons where the actual job of removing waste from the urine and excess water and excess salts, and then reabsorbing stuff that could be reused by your body takes place. We also can sometimes see this prefix uro, which of course refers to the urinary system as well. Urology is actually really interesting. It can refer to the study of the urinary system of either sex, but because the male urinary and reproductive systems are intertwined, many urologists can also specialize in the male reproductive system. So here's the female urinary system. We mentioned the males is kind of melded with the reproductive system. In females, it is completely separate to be able to facilitate pregnancy. So we have 3 separate openings for 3 separate body systems located in that inguinal region. So we talked about the anus for the digestive system in our last unit. This unit, we're going to talk about the urethra, which is the exit for urine. And then in our final unit, we will talk about the vagina, which is for the reproductive system. So 3 separate systems, 3 separate openings. When we're looking here, we just have 2 kidneys, 1 on either side. Notice they're offset just a little bit, which just helps everything fit more easily in that lower back region. Very large blood vessels because their main job is to filter blood. And then the tubes that come off their medial side and go inferiorly to the bladder, and then the bladder will exit out the body through the urethra. Now, this little organ sitting right on top of the bladder is the uterus. So this is a non-pregnant uterus, and you'll notice that it just kind of sits right on top of it like a hat. But you can imagine how a pregnant uterus full of 8 to 10 pounds of baby would put significant pressure on that bladder during the later stages of pregnancy. So for comparison, this is the male urinary system. We sometimes call it the urogenital system just because those 2, the reproductive system is kind of intertwined. So we see the same arrangement, the kidneys, the ureter, the bladder. The difference is that the testes and the vas deferens also pass through the prostate, and the first section of the urethra passes through the prostate, and then that is the actual point of merging of those 2 systems. So the urethra in males actually is the exit point for the urinary system and the reproductive system. Both urine and semen exit out the urethra at different times. So we will talk in this unit about the urinary system, and then we will revisit this idea in Unit 10 when we talk specifically about the production and secretion of semen. So some really important functions for the urinary system. They're going to regulate lots of aspects of your blood homeostasis. That includes pH, volume, pressure, which are always related, osmolarity, which is like the saltiness of the blood, ion concentration, and glucose concentration. The kidneys themselves produce a couple of different hormones that are really important. Calcitriol, which actually works hand in hand with calcitonin to help increase blood pressure or blood calcium rather, and erythropoietin, which is actually the hormone that triggers the production of red blood cells. Erythropoietin can be released when blood volume or pressure is too low. So that's another side effect besides reabsorbing more water and helping to pump up the volume. We can also make it a little bit more viscous, and that helps with pressure. And of course, the most obvious one that you probably already knew is it excretes liquid waste called urea, which is a byproduct of protein metabolism, and also will get rid of drugs and toxins along with any excess, ions, glucose, water, all that other stuff. Okay, so the main organ of the kidneys that performs all of those functions are the kidneys. There's two of them, and they will filter blood and produce urine to do all those functions we talked about on the previous slide. The external structures are ones that we've heard of before. A hilum is just a little indentation where all of the tubes enter and exit the organ. And then a capsule is just that connective tissue that surrounds it and helps it keep its shape. Some other tubes that are located in that hilum, the renal artery, which brings the blood to each kidney, the renal veins, which drain the blood from each kidney. The suprarenal arteries are also located in the general region, and they actually feed the adrenal glands. Another name for the adrenal gland are suprarenal because they sit on top of each kidney. There's those adrenal glands. Their job is to produce a variety of hormones that help regulate blood composition and the fight or flight response. So here is a realistic human kidney, and it's not as pretty, but you can kind of see all these structures. Adrenal gland sitting on top of it like a hat. Here's the kidney itself. We have all these different tubes, so suprarenal arteries, that renal artery, which is very large, and the renal vein that is even larger. And then this ureter, which is a little washed out, but that's the little tube that will exit inferiorly out of each kidney, and that will bring the urine to the bladder. So the internal anatomy of the kidney is quite a bit more interesting. Like many of our other gland or organs, it contains an outer cortex. Think of it as being the letter C, okay, for cortex, and then the deeper region, which is the medulla. And just like other organs with cortexes, that superficial region is where most of the functionality happens. As far as the kidney is concerned, that cortex is even further subdivided into two zones, with the superficial zone called the cortical zone, because this is the cortex. This is most of the cortex. And then the deep zone right before it transitions into medulla is called the juxtamedullary zone. So it's interesting that we actually have nephrons that are named according to these two regions that we'll talk about at the very end of today's notes. The cortical zone is where most nephrons are found, and it can produce urine that's just of medium average osmolarity, whereas the juxtamedullary zone will contain nephrons that can create really, really concentrated urine for times that you are maybe a little bit dehydrated. Some other regions, the renal columns, which are pieces of the cortex that will actually cut down through the renal pyramids or the medulla, and then the nephrons, which are the microscopic units that we will look at. We'll have a picture. Oh, here's our picture that makes a little bit more sense. So this nephron is greatly exaggerated in size, just so you can kind of see what it looks like. This is actually a cortical nephron. Actually, this might be a juxtamedullary nephron. The renal corpuscle here, this little bulb that it starts with, is fairly low. Some of them might be way closer to the more superficial regions of the cortex here. But this lighter color all the way around, making that letter C, is going to be the cortex. There's little columns that will penetrate a little bit deeper. Those are the columns. The renal medulla are going to be these pyramid-shaped structures, and that goes all the way into this kind of renal pelvis, is what we call this muscular region where the urine will eventually exit. So that deeper renal medulla is where the urine is simply collected. So most of the adjustment of the composition of the urine is going to be happening in that cortex. The renal pyramids are just cone-shaped collection apparatuses, and one lobe can be described as a single pyramid and half of each of the columns next to it, and that'll be outlined in our picture here on the next slide. So here is our renal lobe. So you can see that is just one region, and you can see this kidney has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 renal lobes. Also remember the same issue we had kind of with our last unit. This is a three-dimensional organ. Kidneys are not flat. They're not spherical, but they definitely have a three-dimensional nature. So when you think of these columns, they're more like a pyramid, like a pyramid with a circular bottom, like a cone almost. And so that cone will filter all of that fluid down into the bottom. So think of these as cones that are working in a three-dimensional nature here. Okay, so now I have labeled that pyramid and that lobe in there. If you wanted to take a minute and pause, you can fill in your notes, feel free. So here's some other, the drainage pattern that goes through an individual nephron. So the actual process of making urine begins in the nephron. Each nephron will drain into what's called the renal papilla, into a minor calyx, a major calyx, the renal pelvis, and then the renal pelvis will taper and become the ureter. Like always, I guess I'm a very visual person. I think the pictures make more sense than just looking at those definitions. But remember, in real life, this nephron is actually microscopic. It's going to be a lot smaller. And so there could be, hundreds of nephrons within this one renal pyramid in 3 dimensions, and then each of the collecting ducts will drain into this kind of white spot. So that's what the renal papilla you can see is at the end, the bottom of each cone here at the bottom of each pyramid. Each individual pyramid has a minor calyx, and then here we have 3 minor calyxes draining into a major calyx. All the major calyces will then drain through the renal pelvis and then to the ureter. The ureter will then bring the urine to the bladder where it will be collected until it can be excreted. Okay, so just an overview again. I mentioned this earlier, but hopefully you've already watched the notes. You copied anything you needed to, rewatch if necessary. You've already completed the Ed puzzle, and you can do that as many times as you like until you get 100%. The last thing you have to do is the comments below. 3 things you're thankful for, 2 things you learned, and 1 question you still have. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and we will see you guys tomorrow.